Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you live in the world. My name is Bonnie Howard. I'm a senior fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and I'd like to thank you for joining our session today, starting from a place of strength, United Ways using data and messaging to tell an impact story. I think we'd all agree that narrative is powerful, and who controls it can wield either a weapon or a wand. We're living in a time where information is plentiful and our access to it has never been easier. But we're also not always sure what's real and what's Memorex. I know that word Memorex probably dates me, so maybe a better description is what's real and what's AI. How we frame the work is critical if we want to be heard and understood. The Frameworks Institute has been at the forefront of research around how people think and talk about important social issues. What are the mindsets, narratives, and frames that lead to social change? And United Way, too, like the rest of the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors, continues to wrestle with how to talk about the work we're doing in a way that is accurate, inspiring, and capable of compelling others to take action. We're living in challenging times. Things are changing at a rapid clip. The sheer volume of information in and of itself is overwhelming. We have to appreciate the cultural context, realizing that it too is evolving and iterating. So today we want to talk about how to hold these realities and not be immobilized by them, share with you the big idea of collective caring, look at some data that gives us a reason to believe, and engage you in a conversation that will help us to be clear, compelling, and most important, resonates in a way that helps us achieve good outcomes for kids and families. So we have a few, I think, powerhouse folks who are going to be leading our discussion today, and I'm just going to take a moment to briefly introduce them. First, we have David Alexander, whose career as a pediatrician and advocate for children spans more than 3 decades. He's currently president of Leading for Kids, which was established in 2018 with the initial funding from the Lucille Packard Foundation for Children's Health, with a mission to create a society that puts children first. From 2007 to 2018, he served as president and CEO of the Lucille Packard Foundation for Children's Health. Over his career, David has held numerous leadership positions at children's hospitals across the country. Thomas Jefferson University named him Pediatric Faculty Member of the Year in 1987. He served on numerous boards, including the National Association of Children's Hospital Board, Directors, and Stanford Child Health Research Institute Board of Directors. And if that's not enough, he's also a published author. Gretchen Green Serenak is Director of Success by Six at the United Way of Central Florida. She's worked for nonprofits and public service her entire career. A fourth-generation Floridian, she graduated from the University of South Florida and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. Gretchen served 10 years as a communications officer and transition assistance officer and was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. She served in various leadership roles at Polk County Public Schools, Lakeland Police Citizens Advisory Board, and as a guardian ad litem. Iola Fortune is Vice President of the Impact Team at United Way Worldwide. She provides oversight, strategic guidance, and support to team members managing key initiatives in education, economic mobility, health, human trafficking, and disaster relief. She leads efforts to support local United Ways to advance equitable community impact by developing frameworks, strategies, peer learning, and training opportunities. And finally, to lead our conversation and sort of moderate us today is Marjorie Sims. She's the managing director of Ascend at the Aspen Institute, a convener for diverse leaders working across systems and sectors to build intergenerational family prosperity. Marjorie has more than 20 years of experience in advocating for the status of women and families at local, state, national, and international levels. And I think at this point, I'm actually, instead of where you'd normally kick it to Marjorie to moderate for us, we're going to turn it right over to David, who's going to provide us really some context and I think foundation for the conversation that we hope to have with you all today. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to David.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you all. And I wanted to spend a few minutes telling you about the work that I have been doing with my organization, Leading for Kids, along with the Frameworks Institute. Somebody in my introduction said I've been a pediatrician for more than 3 decades. That's now well into my fourth decade. Throughout that time, I've been struck by a number of paradoxes. Number one, if you look at the health of children as we've defined it in pediatrics. We've made incredible progress during my time as a pediatrician. Just when I was a resident, the most common reason, second most common reason kids were admitted to the hospital was an infection with a bacteria called Haemophilus influenza, which most pediatricians have never seen today because we have a vaccine that has basically eliminated it as a problem. When I was a resident, it was very unusual to ever see a patient with fibrosis who made it to adolescence. And today there are more adults than children with cystic fibrosis. So we've made incredible progress if you look at health as defined narrowly. But if you look at the well-being of children, if you look at how they're doing in general, we have not moved the needle in the same kind of way. And I've really wondered for the past 30 years why. And it brings me to another one of these paradoxes that sort of struck me over time, which is that we as Americans, when we live our daily lives, we center our decisions, what we do and how we do it, largely on what's good for our kids and grandkids. That's the way we live our lives, but we do not do that as a society. We do not center the well-being of our kids and grandkids in the way we make decisions collectively. And why is that? So in 2017, with a grant from my former employee, the Lucille Packard Foundation, I established this little nonprofit I run now called Leading for Kids to understand the culture in America that leads us to the situation that we're in and to maybe start to do some things to change our culture. Um, and that as a pediatrician put me in some very strange places because I am not a social scientist and I was delving in areas that I really didn't understand. So the first thing I did was when I started Leading for Kids was I went to some places where kids are doing better than they are in the United States. And unfortunately, they're not hard to find. In fact, if you go to virtually any other industrialized country in the world and you look at the broad measures of child health and well-being, poverty and education and all those other things, kids are doing better than they are in the United States. And the reality is, if you look at any individual country, if you've seen one country and how they care for their kids, you've seen one country, everybody does it a little differently. But there were some things that I noticed in common among the countries where kids were doing better than they are here that were quite different than us. And one of the things that I noticed was that advocates in other countries, when they talked about why kids should get the things that we all know they should get, they talked differently than we did. They explained, if you asked an advocate in Germany why children should not be hungry, they would say because children have a right to not be hungry. So they use rights language to explain a lot of this, as they do in much of the rest of Western society anyway. Um, and I didn't know it at the time, but what they're doing is they're using a different frame to advocate for children. They're talking about using rights as a reason that kids should get things. And around the time I came back from that trip, I had the good fortune to meet folks from the Frameworks Institute. And the Frameworks Institute is a DC-based nonprofit that for the last 25 plus years has tried to understand the way language or framing is used by advocates to impact the way their work reflects in society. And they've looked at the way advocates across a broad range of social issues talk and how that works or doesn't work. And we put together a plan to do a very typical frameworks project to understand how Americans think about kids and families, and are there better ways for us as advocates to communicate about that? So we ended up, we were very fortunate to be funded in this work by grants from both the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Children's Hospital Association, and set out in the beginning of 2020 to do what was supposed to be an 18-month project to do this work, to identify new ways of talking about kids and to put them into use. And it turned out to be a much more challenging project than we had thought, and it took us more than 4 years to come to the point where we're at today. So let me tell you a little bit about this. So first of all, before I go any further, I want to talk about what's a mindset and what's a frame, because I'm going to use that term a bit. So a mindset, at least in the way we use it in our work, is a commonly held belief that's available to most people in a society. It doesn't mean that everybody thinks this way all the time or that everybody thinks it, but it's pretty commonly held. So a common mindset in America, for example, is what the social scientists would call individualism. That what happens to you is largely a result of the effort that you put into it. Um, and that is, in large part, what has driven American progress over the last 3 centuries. This notion of the rugged individualist who strives every day to make things better for them and their family. So that's a very commonly held mindset. Another mindset that's common in America is this notion of American exceptionalism, the notion that America is a special place and that we do most things better than um, most countries in the world. So that's a mindset. Once again, mindsets are not something that we all hold all the time. So while I said that, individualism, for example, is a very commonly held mindset in America, we in times of crisis very frequently are able to act collectively, but it's not our default mechanism. So there's another mindset called collectivism that's sitting there in the background waiting to be triggered. But the predominant mindset for us in America is this mindset of individualism. So the first thing that we did was that we went out and tried to understand what are the mindsets that drive Americans thinking about kids. And there's a long, long research report that's available on our website, which I think they will make available to you, that describes that. And there are many mindsets that drive Americans thinking about kids, but I want to focus on 2 or 3 of them for right now. Number one, Americans think of kids as these little beings that require care. And how well a child does in life is largely dependent on the love and care that's given to them by the people around them. And that's not wrong. That mindset is not wrong. But that mindset, if it's predominant, allows people to sort of ignore all of the other systemic things in our society that may or may not impact the way kids do in life. So this centrality of care mindset is really important to the way Americans think about kids. And a second mindset that drives the way Americans think about kids is the fact that Americans think about kids' issues very narrowly. So if you ask Americans what's a children's issue, they're all issues related to care. So they think about childcare as a kid's issue, and they think about education as a kid's issue, and they think about a little bit about healthcare, but they don't think about poverty as a kid's issue. They don't think about climate as a kid's issue. They don't think about housing as a kid's issue. They think pretty narrowly about kids' issues. So that's kind of a very high level view of what the mindsets that are out there in society today, whether they're good or bad or indifferent, those are what's out there today. We then started to look at what are the frames that advocates use, and frames are active choices that advocates use to talk about the issues that they care about. So an example of framing, and I will try to be minimally political in this conversation, but if you watch MSNBC and they talk about January 6th, they will talk about an insurrection. That's a frame for January 6th. And if you watch Fox News, you will frequently hear people talk about protesters who are protesting an unjust election. Those are 2 ways of framing, using language to frame the same set of events targeted to create different impacts on the listener. So we went out and tried to understand the way American children's advocates talk about kids' issues. What are the frames that we use today to talk about kids' issues? And we, in essence, as American advocates, use one of 3 frames when we talk about why kids should get the things that we all know they should get. So number one, kids should get this thing that we're advocating for because it's the right thing to do. It's moral. It's just. So there's this, moral justice frame that we use. The second frame that we as American advocates like to use is kids should get this thing because they're vulnerable and we have to look out for them. So that's a vulnerability frame. And then the third frame that we use, which is really relatively new in the last 20 or 25 years, is we should do this thing for kids because kids are a great investment. We need to invest in them. They're the next generation. We need to do this investment now. There's no better way for us to spend our dollars than to invest in children. And if you think about your own organizations and the organizations you know, I would guess that they use one, two, or three of those frames to advocate for the work that they're doing. And none of those frames are bad. Um, but the reality is that those frames have gotten us where we are today. And we would be worse off if people weren't out there using that framing. But if you want to move things, if you want to create real substantial progress for kids and families, it's not this alone, but one of the ways to do that is to think about using a different kind of frame to bring more people into the tent. The frames that we use, this moral justice frame, this vulnerability frame, and this investment frame work really well for us, work really well for our current supporters, but they haven't allowed us to do the things that we all know need to be done. And we know as a field what kids and families need. It's not like we don't know the solutions for the problems that plague kids and families today. We know what they are, and there's lots and lots of fantastic organizations out there with great solutions to these problems, but we haven't been able to move them. We haven't been able to bring any of them to scale, and we certainly haven't been able to center our public policy and our public life in what's good for kids. So knowing the way the public thinks about kids and knowing the way advocates are currently talking, we set out to try to find a new way to talk about kids' issues. And we set out on what was supposed to be 4 months of work testing new frames, looking to do three things. And the way we define success in this work is if we talk about kids' issues in a certain way, does it A, increase our sense of collective responsibility for all children, not just their own children? So if we talk about kids' issues in a different way, does it make people feel more responsible for all children? Number two, does it raise the salience of kids' issues? And when I say salience, I mean um, uh, importance that people will act on. So if you ask people about a dozen kids programs and are they important, everybody in America will say all kids programs are important. But if you ask people in America to rank any kids program you can think of on a 1 to 5 scale as to how important a candidate's decision is on this program, on your decision to vote for him or her, nothing scores higher than a 3 on a 5-point scale. And we've done this work. So these issues are important to the public, but they're not salient. They don't drive people's decision makings. So we were looking for framing that moved that salient to make these issues more salient to people. And then the third thing that we were looking for, and it was not an initial goal, but it was something that became very important to us during the work, was does the framing that we were testing decrease the sense that some children are more or less deserving than others? And one of the dark underbellies of this notion of American individualism, the upside is that if you work really hard, anything's possible. The downside is that there is a deeply held mindset in many Americans that if you're not doing well, it's because you're not trying hard enough, and that you are not deserving of help. And so, was there a framing that we could identify that would decrease that sense that some people are not as deserving as others? So we embarked on what was supposed to be about 4 months of work to try to identify and test new frames. And that work took 2 years. And that's because everything we tested at the beginning did not work. And we had this kind of running joke in the project that the more David Alexander, me, was excited about a new frame we were going to test, the worse it did with the general public. And that's because I think like a child advocate instead of thinking the way the general public thinks. So after literally a year and a half of failing at identifying new ways of framing, and we tried all sorts of clever things, none of which worked. One of the researchers said, why don't we step back and instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, try to think about the ways Americans are currently thinking about kids. And remember, I said that one of the major things that drives the way Americans think about kids is this notion of care. And the researcher we were working with said, why don't we try to stretch the way Americans think about kids? And so we came up with this new framing called collective caregiving. And what collective caregiving does is it takes this notion of care and stretches it in three very important ways. Number one, right now, most people, when they think about care, they think of things that are done by individuals to individuals. So it's care that's provided by a parent to a child, or by a teacher to a student, or by a doctor or a nurse to a patient. And it tries to stretch that using language um, so that care becomes something that we can do collectively to all people. So one of the most important things that we can do to care for our kids is to vote for candidates who center the well-being of children in their decisions. So it's tying voting to care. So explicitly linking this word care, which is where people are already starting from, to things that we can do together. So that's the first stretch, is taking care from something that's individual to care that's something that's collective. The second stretch is by explicitly calling out the fact that we can and should care for children that don't necessarily look like ours. And this is a way to actually talk about diversity and equity that doesn't send people running for the PC police. And what's very striking, and I'm not going to have the time today to talk about this in any detail, but it turns out that this is a frame that you can use to talk about issues of diversity and equity that resonates with everybody in the population, but resonates especially well with people who define themselves as conservative or Republican. So, an example of this kind of framing is one of the most important things we can do for our children is to make sure one of the most important things we can do to care for our children is to make sure that their schools have the resources that they need to do well. Right now, we do not provide that care equally, and we especially don't provide that care to schools that are predominantly Black and brown. Now, that doesn't sound all that different than what we're saying, but it actually resonates very, very well with people who might not start out resonating well with that kind of a message. So it's a way to talk about equity and diversity that centers it in care and in unequal care um, that resonates very well with the general population. And the third way to stretch this concept of care is to take the narrow band of things that people think of as care issues and bring care into every issue. So, one of the most important ways we can care for our children is to make sure that their schools are safe from gun violence. So, instead of starting out talking about the epidemic of gun violence, we would say that this is a care issue. One of the most important things we can do to care for our children is to make sure that they are not hungry when they go to school. So bringing care into every issue. So I'll give you one more example of a way to sort of use this framing based in kind of what we have done historically, and then I will turn it over to the rest of my co-panelists. So during the pandemic, uh, we were able to get past something that had been talked about for a long time, which is an expansion of the child tax credit. And the child tax credit, as it was passed during the pandemic, did some incredible things. Most notably, it was the largest single investment to decrease child poverty in the nation's history, and it cut the rate of child poverty in America by more than half. So it was a temporary measure, and when it was going to need to be renewed, what did we as child advocates do? How did we frame our argument for continuing with the child tax credit? Well, we went back to kind of our safe space and started talking about vulnerable children living in poverty, and said that we needed to do this because look what it did to reduce the poverty rate in America. And in retrospect, not very surprisingly, that effort failed. And I wish this weren't the case, but Americans in general don't care about poor people in the way that those of us in this room might. And that's largely because of this mindset in America about individualism and the dark underbelly of that being deservingness, that if you're poor, you're probably not trying as hard as you might. So, an alternative way to frame the child tax credit might have been using the framing that we have come up with. One of the most important things that we can do to care for our kids and their families is to make sure that they have the resources they need to raise their kids. And the child tax credit provides 90% of American families with additional resources that they can use to raise their children. That's an alternative framing that's very foreign feeling to what we as advocates do because we really go to the heart of it and trying to help those who are in most need. But that framing did not work. And I would argue that this alternative framing, which was also accurate, might have been more effective at helping to move the public and making this a more salient issue. Um, so I will stop there and turn it over to the rest of the panel. And hopefully, if you have questions about anything I've said, you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A. And I'm sorry to have given you such a long lecture, but I'll look forward to conversing with you in a little bit.
So, David, I didn't think it was a lecture. Again, for those in the audience, I'm Marjorie Sims. I'm Managing Director at Ascend, and I'm honored to be the moderator for this conversation. David, I certainly appreciated the definitions that you gave for mindset and frames. I actually put them in the chat. But when you were talking, what really became clear to me is that you were trying to expand mindsets, not necessarily change mindsets. You're trying to expand the way people think about kids and think about these issues using very specific frames. So we'll come back to you with some, specific questions. One of the questions that I have at the top of my mind, I'd love to get under the hood a little bit around some of the research that you did. What was the scale of that research? How long did it take? How many people were involved? So we'll come back to that. But right now, I would like to introduce and turn this over to Iola Fortune, who is with United Way Worldwide. It is Ascend's honor and pleasure to be partnering with United Way Worldwide on these webinars, as well as the campaign for grade level reading. So I will turn it over to Iola, who's going to share some data that they're using to undergird these frames and issues. Thanks,
Thank
Iola.
you. Thank you so much, Marjorie. And thank you, David, for really setting up the conversation well. I'm really looking forward to the discussion portion of our call, because a lot of what you said resonates with me as I think about how our network, and the work that we do of community impact, how we leverage and use those frames. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And I'll just say hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to be with you today and to talk about the other piece of this. So David talked about message framing. I'm going to talk about data as part of that, as part of conveying the impact of the work that we do, and creating creating a compelling case for change. First, I'll share a little bit about United Way for those of you who may not be familiar with who we are. We are a global nonprofit with over 1,000 local United Ways operating in 36 countries. We are global, but we're also hyper local. And United Ways work to advance equitable community change in the communities we serve around the world. So we have brand, we're well known, we have reach, we have relationships, community knowledge, and that will be a theme we'll return to, and know-how to address major issues and work with others to create those shared solutions. Our approach to community impact is grounded in data to understand the issues that concern everyday citizens in the communities that we serve. And this includes national, local, state data on key indicators related to the issues that we work on in the areas of youth opportunity, financial security, health, and community resilience. We use data, and wherever possible, disaggregated data. And data sources like 211, if you have one in your community, they're covered 93% of the country, I believe, to understand the scope and the prevalence of issues in your local communities, to understand who is impacted by an issue and to what extent that issue is a problem for how many community residents. We engage residents to further understand the root causes of those issues through them sharing their own lived experience. So data, qualitative and quantitative, is part and parcel of how we work. We know that data, when we think about equity, is critical to highlighting the gaps and disparities in experiences and opportunities and resources. So that is why it's one of the levers that we included in our United Way Equity Framework that we produced a few years ago. In addition to data as a flashlight to understand issues, United Ways use data to determine priorities, to develop strategies, to track our progress, and to convey our results to key stakeholders. And that's always starts with the community. but also our donors and our partners. So I want to focus next on how we gather that data to convey our impact and what the results show us in relation to early childhood. United Way's Impact Survey is administered annually to demonstrate our network's reach and role as a driver of scalable, equitable change that improves lives and strengthens communities. And data from this survey, we believe, documents the collective reach and results of participating United Ways. So it helps to demonstrate our ability to drive that scalable change. And on this slide, you see that the data I'm sharing represents data over 2 years and from 545 United Ways. So that's roughly over 50% of our network. More importantly, it represents almost 100% of our largest United Ways and more than half of all United Ways over the past 2 years. And so it gives us the confidence that the work we are sharing is representative of the work as a whole. So if you go to the next slide, relative to our conversation today, consistently, youth opportunity remains the most common area of work across all United Ways, where 9 in 10 United Ways do some form of work that touches the birth to 21 continuum. And that's followed by financial literacy, healthy community, and community resiliency. And that reflects that we see these issues as fundamentally integrated as they impact families. How United Ways invest resources, we share a little bit here about what that looks like. The most important takeaway there is that 2/3 of our United Ways use some sort of criteria to make those strategic community investments to work to make progress on these issues. And those criteria can range from looking at a organization's financial stability and operations to their program goals. Most importantly, how they align with community goals, priorities, and strategies. And as we dig a little bit more deeply into the data, I think it's important to note that we are making a difference. So if we go to the next slide, in youth opportunity, we are collectively focused on helping all young people reach their fullest potential. And so if you look at what's common in our network, the most common strategies that United Ways have used related to this are increasing reading proficiency, ensuring access to high quality early childhood programs, and engaging families to support their child's development. So that's where we show up the most. If you go to the next slide, here's where we can start to use data to dig deeper, to tell that story at the strategy, outcome, and reach level. So first, if you look at the left, what are United Ways doing more deeply in each of those 3 areas I just mentioned? Of the United Ways that are focused on increasing access to quality early learning environments, the most common thing United Ways are doing and it's an equity approach, is ensuring access to programs in historically underserved communities, increasing access to community-based learning experiences like Born Learning, and strengthening the quality of programs everywhere. So that is a little bit about what we're doing collectively as a network. Then if you start to move to the center of the slide, this starts to look at impact. Who are we reaching? And we know in terms of enrollment in high quality early learning programs that are supported by United Ways, close to 600,000 children have benefited from those efforts. So that's what we do. That's who we're reaching. And then on the far right is what is the impact of all of that? And that's what's most important in terms of what's the difference we're making. So we could have great reach and fantastic strategies, but are they making any difference in the lives of people that we serve? And we can say yes, based on the data that we've gathered, we have helped 74% of children achieve those key developmental milestones from ages 0 to 5. And we've ensured that 73% of the children served through United Way efforts are ready for school. Moving on to the next slide, where we showcase some of our literacy work. In the area of literacy supports, the strategies that United Ways are employing include leading reading campaigns, supporting students who are not reading at grade level, engaging volunteers from the community to serve as volunteer readers, implementing summer programs when schools are closed so students can stay engaged in learning, including rich literacy experiences, and increasing access to books in the home through efforts like Dolly Parton Imagination Library. In literacy supports, and we start to look at that reach and results, local United Ways that responded to the survey collectively have provided some form of literacy support to over 670,000 children, which has resulted in more than half of children served reading at grade level. And when you think about the fact that just under 1 in 3, based on 2022 NAEP data, about 33% of our nation's fourth graders are actually at or above proficient. That, when you contextualize the data, which is so important, helps give us a barometer for the progress that we're making through the kinds of efforts that United Ways are leading with community partners. And so that also relates to another point around always contextualizing the data so we understand this within what's the magnitude and scope of the issue, and understanding that at multiple levels. And then that helps to sort of demonstrate the impact as well. If we go to the next slide, in the area of family engagement, which was the third most common strategy, United Ways are ensuring that families have resources and supports that they need to support their child's early childhood development, that they are connecting them with vital information, and they're leveraging community-based resources to do that work. So that's more about the approach in terms of how we're doing that to strengthen families as their child's first teacher. And so in terms of that reach, that's over 1.1 million families that are served and that feel that they have the resources, the skills, the networks, the opportunities that they can then use to support their child's overall development. If we go to the next slide, this just gives you a sense of some of those most common programs that United Ways in their role as conveners, as intermediaries, helping to tap into and align and coordinate community-based resources are leveraging. And so I'll wrap up here by sharing a few more things. First of all, for United Ways that are on the call, I encourage you to dig more deeply into this data, which is available on United Way online, our intranet. And I'll conclude by saying that we know that data on the issues, on the work that we do and the outcomes we deliver is vital to making a case. It is necessary, but it's not sufficient. As you heard from David, we have to connect it both to the frames that resonate, currently with people in the culture and society in which we live, and then stretching that, changing the frame. And so one of the things that I think is important for United Ways as we do that messaging about our work is sometimes the issues that we talk about can seem intractable. They can seem unsolvable. Poverty is I put that right at the forefront. And so I love David's example of the child tax credit, because in a fairly short period of time, we cut child poverty in half through that policy measure. Even though not sustained, it showed us what is possible. And so a lot of our messaging in terms of the framing we use has to show people what is possible through the collective efforts. Shortly, you're going to hear from my colleague Gretchen at the United Way of Central Florida. And I think these themes will come through as she shares their work, particularly in early childhood under Success by 6. And you'll hear firsthand how they're leveraging the data, both to sort of be a diagnostic, but then also to drive strategy and to showcase outcomes, but then also how that is integrated with their messaging. And I'll stop there and turn it back over to you, Marjorie.
Thank you so much, Iola. That was a really in-depth presentation about how you surface your data and how you use it really intentionally. So thank you so much for that. And I'm now going to just turn it over to Gretchen so she can share the work that she's doing. And welcome, Gretchen.
Hi, good afternoon. Gretchen Suranek, Director of Success by 6 with United Way of Central Florida. Thank you for inviting me today to share about how our United Way here in Central Florida is serving children and families in our community. Just a little background, Success by 6 was founded in 1995 by Carol Jenkins Barnett, Director of Public Supermarket Charities, and spearheaded by United Way of Central Florida. We've brought together businesses in our community, religious groups, educators, health and human service organizations to really care and serve for the most vulnerable population, our children. On the next slide, you will see our coverage area. We serve a tri-county area of Polk, Hardy, and Highlands. And something that I personally am not thrilled about, Polk County is currently the fastest growing county in the state of Florida and the 7th fastest in the nation. So we are really trying to keep up with all of that growth and population change. And as a result of that, the greatest growth that we're seeing is in that 0 to 18 age group, which really emphasizes the need for quality education, childcare programs to support all of those children and families in our community. On the next slide, you will see a little bit about where we are in the state and where we are in our particular county here. The state of Florida right now, when you look at kindergarten readiness, they have 51% of children starting kindergarten are what they consider kindergarten ready. Ready to start, know their letters, numbers, name, can sit for 10 minutes uninterrupted. And here in our county, only 44% are showing ready to start kindergarten. So that is below the state percentage, which is why we're doing the work that we're doing. We think it's vital to wrap around these children and families. And we also did a needs assessment in the Tri-County area, and that showed that residents are very concerned with the lack of quality preschool and after-school programs, as well as teacher shortages and the cost of quality educational programs. So a little bit about our particular United Way and what it looks like. On the next slide, you'll see we currently have 7 different initiatives that we are using to serve children and families in our community. I'm not going to go into each of them. I know that there is going to be a link to our website that fully goes into each of these initiatives, and you can learn more. You can also reach out to me at any time, and I'd be happy to talk with you about it. But as a result of the data and the focus that we have on the importance of early childhood education and family and community support, our United Way here in our Success by 6 program really has strategies that come alongside the children and provide support and results that help families. So on the next slide, I'm just going to go into a couple of these initiatives that I think are really important. We have what's called a Children's Resource Center. The full name is the Carol Jenkins Barnett United Way Children's Resource Center. And some numbers here will show from last year, we provide weekly developmental classes. These are free and they're open to any family in our community. They are focused for children 0 to 5. And these classes are taught by an early childhood education specialist, and they focus on socialization, language and literacy, social emotional activities for both the caregiver and the child. I often say that the parents are learning more than the children because they will see ways that their child is learning and growing, and they're able to utilize that at home and outside of the classroom to really care for that child and ensure that they are entering kindergarten, ready to do well. You can see that we offer free developmental screenings. I really can't say enough about this. We're partnering with Help Me Grow and Heart of Florida with this program. And of the 77 screenings that we did last year, 26 were referred for follow-up services. So those 26 kids, before they started school, were identified with some kind of delay that they were able to get direct service, again, before they started kindergarten, because we know kindergarten is not what it used to be. It's a lot faster. It's harder to keep up. And so oftentimes these kids get lost, and it's really hard for them to catch up, especially by 3rd grade. So we're very adamant about the importance of these developmental screenings and making sure that children get the services they need before they start school. We Also provide different support groups here at the CRC. We have an autism support group, a Down syndrome support group, and a new parent / breastfeeding support group. A wonderful way that we engage the community in these groups is that we utilize their expertise to come into our program and support us. So for example, our local hospital has nurses that volunteer 1 day a week for that breastfeeding support group. It costs us nothing, but it is a win-win. They get to volunteer some time in something that they are an expert in, and they get to really help families that may need a little bit of extra help. We have specialists in the community that will come out to our autism support group, and we have teachers that will come and provide tutoring to a low-income bilingual school that is nearby that couldn't, don't have the funds to send their child for specialized tutoring. On the next slide, you will see one of our other initiatives is called the Master Teacher Program. These master teachers work directly with teachers in low to moderate income childcare centers that may not have an enriching program. Picture, this high-end childcare program where they're doing STEM activities, and then another potentially neighborhood childhood center that is more of just daycare, right? They're just watching those children until the parents can pick them up. These master teachers work alongside those site directors and teachers. They provide daily workshops. They use appropriate practices in activities in the classroom, along with parent communication, discipline, and curriculum. And so we do pre and post testing. This is just one of the data tools that we use in the Master Teacher Program, and this is the Peabody test. There is a pre-test done when they start, and then 25 days later, they do a post-test. And you can see a drastic increase in both their expressive and receptive vocabulary. In that short 25 days, they grow over 6 months, which again, prepares those children for a better start at school. On the next slide, you will see our Reading Pals program. This is a program that pairs volunteer mentors that really care about children in our community and want to give back. And they pair them with kindergarten students that have been identified as needing a little bit of extra support, whether it's social emotional support or just kindergarten readiness support. And so we track those students with comparison students. And you'll see here on this slide 2 really important results that show, interestingly enough, there is data that shows the improvement on literacy and math. But I love this slide because it shows that the program students in the Reading Pals program have higher attendance, right? So these kids are showing up to school because they have someone that cares about them, a mentor that they don't want to miss. They also have less disciplined referrals than the comparison students, which I think is significant. On the last slide, I want to point out some of our messaging and communication strategies. You can see that we provide English and Spanish flyers. All of our flyers are bright and engaging, informative. We have a very strong social media presence on Facebook, Instagram, and our website. We also engage in billboard and print media, local magazines. We use a lot of, you'll see here on the bottom, there's 2 videos there that you can click on. One is an interview with a mom who attended our breastfeeding support group and then came to our developmental classes and then ended up taking a financial stability class that we offer at the Children's Resource Center, and how that really impacted her family and her life. The second link there at the bottom you'll see is about a mom who had a concern about her child and felt like he was struggling and a little bit behind. She came to one of our developmental screening events, and sure enough, there was some delays. She was then paired up with an agency that was able to come alongside her and help her with her child. She also began attending our developmental classes, and she has some great things to say about how that impacted her family. Some of the pros and cons with especially our communication and our marketing and our space is that we are limited by our space. So we are only so big, and our developmental classes specifically, they fill up pretty much. By the time we open registration, they fill up within a couple hours. So that is a limitation that we have. We are looking at expanding this program because we do have community members on the outskirts of our county that are very interested in replicating this. We also have limited volunteers for things like our Reading Pals program. There are more children that are identified that need to be served in that capacity. And so we are always looking for additional volunteers. Same goes with funding. Iola talked about the Dolly Parton Imagination Library. We currently serve 2,500 children and always have a waiting list in that program. So that is the nutshell of what Success by Six is doing here at United Way of Central Florida. And I am happy to open up for any questions. And again, feel free to reach out to me if you'd like more information.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gretchen. And there actually was a question in the chat specific to you, and I'm going to call back our other panelists, Iola and David, in a second. But the question was, what was the assessment for the Master Teacher Program?
That is called the Peabody Assessment.
Okay,
I can put that link in if you'd like.
Okay, and Leah put some resources in the chat as well. So thank you for that. Okay, if David and Iola wouldn't mind coming back on screen with Gretchen, that would be great. I have some time to engage you all in a Q&A before we open up to the audience questions. But what I would like to first ask you, this, importance of data and strong frame, strong communications, who is your target audience? When you're doing your work, can you name who your target audience is? I think this is really important for people to understand that when you're communicating to specific people. So who are the people that you're communicating with? And Iola, I'll go with you first.
Sure. And I'm smiling because it's something we have to think about so much in our work, Marjorie. And I'll use the term, I'll make it plural. Audiences is really how we approach our work, and segmenting, your communications based on
Absolutely.
the audience. So donors, I'll put them at the top of the list because they help fuel and fund our work and make a lot of our work possible. And United Way is a philanthropy, but we also have to raise that money. And even within donors, you can segment what an individual giver feels moved to support versus your state government versus our corporate partners. You can even segment, and we do segment within donors. So we don't lump them all together because they have different motivations. They have different mindsets and what motivates them to want to support our work. So I'd say that donors are a target audience for a lot of the data that we gather. I would also add that our United Way network is. So the data we gather at the global level, we try to create a feedback mechanism back into our network so they can leverage that data to address their own audiences. Partners are a big part of that in terms of a lot of partners want to work with United Way as a network because of our global reach and scale. And so that data helps substantiate that. And a lot of partners will approach us to want to know who's working where and in what region of the world or in the US. And so partners are also an audience for that. Leaders, so elected and appointed public officials. When we think about the way to achieve a lot of the work we want to support children and families, that has to happen in the policy space. And so to drive systemic change, we know we have to be influencers of policymakers at every level to have that sort of scalable. When we think about scale, that's one of the best ways to achieve it. And then community partners, because when we think about how do we scale, somebody asked a question in Q&A about bright spots and like, how do we scale what works? We have to feed this back into the programs and the community partners and agencies that are frontline delivering the services so we can strengthen and build on success. So I think of it as audiences, and I also think about segmenting that communication based on what motivates them.
Yeah, thank you so much for those, nuances and the audiences and the segmentation within audience target groups. That's really important. So thank you for that. Gretchen, I'd like to go to you. Who are your target audiences, or who's your target audience?
I would say specifically for Success by Six, our target audience is that child and that family that needs the services that we're providing. Whether
Okay.
it is, we are a free tax prep site. So again, our services don't just serve 0 to 5. We really try to come around and provide wraparound services for families. So if a family comes and maybe they come to a developmental class for their 3-year-old, and they know that their neighbor is struggling financially, they can take one of our food drop site flyers, that neighbor. They can share with their cousin who maybe has a child on the autism spectrum disorder that we have an autism support group. So our target audience is really the families that need, and the caregivers. I talked about how important it is that we are not here just for the child, but oftentimes the caregiver learns and receives as much support as the child does. So that is our target audience.
Thank you. So you're really communicating to your community about an opportunity to support kids and families, right? That
Correct.
actually engage. So thank you for that. David, your target audiences for your work.
Yeah. So, back to the question of data. I'll just make a comment that may be a little bit provocative, but I think the way, and I'll cast myself this way, the way those of us who are progressive think is that there's no amount of data that we can't put out to the public that won't help our cause. We just got to give people more and more and more information, and they'll finally come around and realize that we're right about whatever it is that we're talking about, and they'll support us. And I wish it were so, but it's not.
Yeah.
So our audience for this, I would argue that the framing that we as advocates use is really effective at getting us where we are today. And there's nothing wrong with the frames that we're currently using, and nothing wrong with showing data to people who are already kind of on your side. Our work is really designed to grow the tent, right? So, it's interesting to think that when I was in college 1,000 years ago, our relationship as a society to the military was quite different than it is today. We made a cultural change. So when I was in college during Vietnam and soldiers would come home, they would get accosted on the street, as compared to nowadays when people appropriately are giving up their seats on airplanes to let veterans get on. I've often told my 30-something-year-old son that when I was in college, I didn't know anybody who was gay. Now, that's not true. I didn't know anybody who was out. And today, people think about their sexuality in my son's generation the way people think about handedness. That's real culture change. And what we're trying to do is to move our culture so that kids' issues become one of the many third rails of our public life. So right now, it is impossible for an elected official to think about damaging certain things in our culture. That is not the case with kids programs. And so our audience is our society in general, to try to move the way people think about kids, families, and what they need.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I really appreciate your weaving in this, use of data and how it's insufficient. And actually, that was, a comment that was made in the chat to, really illuminate that. So thank you for that. But I also want to ask you again, who are your target audiences? Who are you talking to when you're putting out this, collective framework? Who is it for? Who's your intended audience?
So realize that this research has been out into the world for 4 months now.
Mhm.
So our job right now is mostly to talk to advocates. Um,
Advocates.
uh,
Okay.
so our job right now is to get this stuff used by people who are actually talking to our society. Um, and and that's
Yes.
harder than it sounds because we are all very hardwired to talk about things the way that we've been doing for a long time. And the framing that we're suggesting doesn't seem like it's enough. It doesn't feel natural yet. It kind
Mhm.
of starting to for me, but to those of us who are in the field fighting the good fight every day, we want to come back to the
Wonderful.
things that we've been using, those frames that sort of sit
Mhm.
deeply and resonate with us. And so our work moving forward is to try to get all of us to talk about what we do in a way that actually resonates different with the broader society. So we're not out there talking to the general public. I'm
Wonderful.
not out there trying to do a TED talk to the general public, but I
Right.
am really interested in talking to groups like this to get people to want to learn more about this and how it can impact their own communications to the public.
Yeah, absolutely. Really important because you are talking to influencers, right?
Yep.
People who are talking to others in their community as well as policymakers, right? So to have that influence level is very important. Iola, did you want to
Yeah.
chime in here?
Can I just quickly add, thank you, Marjorie. I said in my remarks that data is necessary but not sufficient. And I think the other piece of that, I do agree, we are swimming upstream.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because of all the reasons that David mentioned. And I'll go a step deeper around who deserves, I think the framing he used, David, was who deserves our care and concern.
Yep.
And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we know by income level, by race, class, religion, gender, you name it, there are different ideas about who deserves of concern, of collective concern, and that's not equal. And I think
Right.
that's really beneath the surface, but it's there. And I would say now it's not so beneath the surface. And then I would also argue that or assert that here that perhaps another thing, and I'd love, David, for you to maybe expand on this, is I think it's also that, and it ties into the individualism, but I'll take it a step further, is that the success of children, and this is where I think we are different than Western democracies and other countries of the world, is ultimately the responsibility of parents and families. I'll broaden it to say families. It is
Mm-hmm.
not the collective responsibility of society. Now, those of us who are in our work, we believe it is the collective work,
Yep.
right? And we talk about children and family and community and that it takes a village and that everybody has a role to play. But I think when we think about parents, especially parents who are affluent and with means and how they navigate and negotiate the system to
Mm-hmm.
get the
Mm-hmm.
outcomes they want for their children, that it is also at some level a very individual enterprise. And I think part of
Yes.
our mindset is that it should be, and that you still
Mm-hmm.
have people who believe that
Yes.
this should be the primary role of parents. And therefore, we're not going to invest that much in sort of a collective kind of response because that's going to shift
Yes.
where the responsibility truly lies.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more, Iola. And I wanted to also layer in here that Ascend, we have looked at this, target audience because we have a community network of 600 nonprofit organizations across the country. We have Ascend Fellows, there are 162. These are very central to our target audiences, and we also segment them because all of those nonprofits are focused on different sectors, as well as our fellows are focused on different sectors. So how do you understand, communicating to philanthropy, to the public sector and human services, to, Head Start programs is really important to our work. We worked with the Frameworks Institute as well as David did to do some frames around how to do a two-generation approach. I'll make certain that playbook that we developed is in the chat because it is how do you talk about working with the family holistically to other community leaders as well as policymakers and systems leaders. That was the target audience for that work. But I want to come back to this, data that is used, because I also think that data is not just about numbers, it's about stories and how you tell those stories, but how do you tell them in a way that it is recognizing the importance of culture and context. And David, I'd love to know from the work that you did, how did you develop that further? And then also, Iola and Gretchen, how are you using that, understanding at the national level and then very specifically in your community? So David, would you like to go first?
Yeah. So you had asked sort of some more specifics on the research, and
Mhm.
first of all, I'm the wrong messenger because I'm not the person who did the research. But this was a very, very large project. There were literally tens of thousands of people who were subjects for this
Mhm.
experiment, for this group of experiments, which was everything from small 8-person focus groups all the way up to
Mhm.
large scale online surveys with tens of thousands of people involved. So these were very, very large research populations that this work was done on.
Okay.
I will tell you that specifically, for example, if you look at this notion of deservingness, um,
Mhm.
there were specific measures that we used to measure people's notion of deservingness that we tested before and after exposure to certain frames. So
Mhm.
we know the effect of using certain frames on the notion of deservingness. I will tell you that one of the many recommendations that comes out of this work is that this vulnerability frame that we love to use as advocates needs to be retired
Mhm.
because vulnerability, when we talk about vulnerable families, it
Right.
triggers this notion of deservingness, and we should stop using it. Um,
Absolutely.
so, um, so that's and there are some specific, and I probably won't go into it now, but there are some specific recommendations about how to tell stories that
Okay.
center care in the work.
In the publication. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. Iola, how are you thinking about, using
Mhm.
your communications, your messaging, your frames to really, support culture and context?
Sure. And I want to give a plug for our marketing and communications team. We rebranded, we did a brand refresh in 2024, and there is a messaging guide that I want to make sure
Okay,
that United Ways have
wonderful.
access to as a tool and resource. But and to answer your question, I'll say it's a struggle. And
Mhm,
it is one
mhm,
that we grapple with. Like, for instance, the data I shared earlier, we'd ask United Ways for success stories. And so we'd pull success stories and then we highlight them on our
mhm,
website and our social media. We have a content calendar where we highlight an issue per quarter. And those stories, and we do it here as well, often play back into the constructs, right? Of like
right.
an individual story of success, right? And
Mhm,
so when you
mhm,
do that, it's still sort of permeating that it's an individual problem. There was an intervention,
right.
and then that individual had a different outcome, right?
Mhm,
And
mhm,
so while that may resonate and that may pull on the heartstrings of those of us who care
mhm,
about people and like, okay, here's a real life example and I see how I can help if I donate or support
right.
this cause, it does not lend itself to structural and systems change.
Absolutely.
It does not lend ourselves to thinking about broad scale policy and why that is necessary. It lends us to thinking we can fix individuals and we can fix families and that
Mhm,
they need to be fixed, not the systems and structures and the context in which they're operating in. And I will tell you candidly, we struggle with how do you change that in our framing. And we also work with the Frameworks Institute when we did a webinar a couple of years ago, part of when we were launching our equity framework. Communications and awareness building was one of the levers for equity,
mhm,
right? For
mhm,
obvious reasons. And so we engaged them to do a webinar to help us rethink some of those frames in terms of how we were framing some of the issues. And I
mhm.
would say ongoing that's an ongoing issue to get better and better at that. And there's no time like the present. The last thing
Right.
I'll say is the context. Usually, I like to present the data on what United Ways are doing, both their reach and their impact and the solutions with like, what's the issue? right? Whose impact?
Right.
Help me understand the issue, the why. Why is this important? And so I think as part of answering in terms of that context you're talking about, you do
Yeah.
have to set the context of why are you even talking to me about this issue.
Absolutely.
And even better, if for local United Ways, they can localize it
Yeah.
and leverage data and stories. And the other thing I wanted to second, Marjorie, is I count in data community engagement. The lived experiences of the people and the communities we serve, that is data. And
Yes.
so that data, it's all of that. And that's all of what we need to piece together. So there are no easy solutions because like I said, we're swimming upstream, but I do think you have to contextualize the data and you have to make the case for why.
Yeah.
Why should I care?
Completely agree on all of those points, Iola.
Can I
And our
make one? Can I
context
make
is
one comment?
always changing. Sure, please.
I pile on to what Iola was saying about these stories, about these heroic efforts, either by a family or by an organization to affect a family. They really reinforce this notion that it's just a matter of individual effort.
Yes.
And we really need to stay away from them. And I make one other comment. Somebody commented before that, this notion that it's the family's job to raise a kid. That is not wrong. What's wrong is that families in America need to do that on their own. And if you
Absolutely.
go to other Western countries where kids are doing better, they fundamentally believe the same thing, that it's the family's primary job to raise their kids, and it's their primary responsibility. But they do it in a context where there's support from the outside. There are systems in place that support them
Absolutely.
in doing that work. And that's the fundamental difference between all of those other countries that are doing better than we are and them. It's still the family's job to raise kids, but they do it in a different context.
That's a really important point, David, because in telling the individual stories, you have to connect it to the systems and the structures that support them, right?
Yep. Yep. And
Okay.
this notion of individualism really allows people to put aside all of the external things
Yep.
that really determine how families do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Gretchen, I did want to come to you on this, question around the context and culture, because you're communicating directly to families, and I'm curious about how you shape your messages given the changing context of your community. You shared some data that your community is growing exponentially. So how are you thinking about the context and culture?
So our marketing team is doing a fantastic job. You can see by the slides that I shared, the flyers. They do a really great job about making sure that the messaging is impactful. We share all of our data with our board of directors. We share it at our annual meeting. We use it in newsletters, like I said previously, on social media platforms. And it really does, it is used to drive what we have found is partner engagement. So we will share a success story, right? And I think David touched on this, but I think the way the message is shared, it is less about look at what this family did, and the takeaway is look at how the support from the community came together to make change. And I think that's really important. And so when those messages are shared, we will often hear from partner agencies that are doing good work for children and families in our community and say, hey, I want to be a part of this. How can I come do good work with you? And we're also seeing that parts of our community, like I said previously, on the outlying areas are saying, hey, I'm seeing all of this good stuff you guys are doing. I'm seeing the impacts that are made, and we want to be a part of it. So we are currently now looking at expanding, basically having a replica of what we're doing here at the Resource Center and expanding into an outreached area, probably about 45 to 50 minutes away, so that we can reach that other demographic in those groups outside of this space.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And always being responsive to the context of your community is important. So thank you. So let's pivot to some of the questions that we got in the Q&A box from our participants. And I'm going to go to this one that is for you, David. It's from Daniela O'Neill. And it says, I assume that you tried the child rights framing prevalent in other countries with your participants, and it is not, if it's not effective, as you didn't mention it as successful framing. If this assumption is correct, do you have a sense of why it wasn't effective?
Yes, so obviously when I came back from actually traveling from the better part of a year to other countries, I came back thinking all we got to do is child rights in America and we'll be just like Europe. And the
Right.
real more interesting question is why haven't we done that? Because child rights comes out of this thing called the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the
Mhm.
most widely adopted human rights compact in the history of planet Earth. And we live in the only country in the world that hasn't signed it. And the more
That has
interesting
not.
question is, since that convention was actually written by Americans, largely during the first Bush administration, why haven't we done it? What is it about us that has kept us from doing
Mhm.
that? And there's a number of things, and we actually did some work with UNICEF to try to understand this. And I won't dwell on all of them, but I think the most fundamental one is that Americans understand the term rights very differently than the rest of the world. Um,
Yes.
so Americans understand a synonym for rights in America is liberty. So if you have the right to something, it means you are free to do it. So we have a right to pray the way we want to, and we have the right to say things that we want to say. But in the rest of the world, there is this concept of social and economic rights that is
Mhm.
very foreign to
Mhm.
us here.
Mhm.
We would consider those entitlements. But in the rest of the
Yes.
world, that term rights includes a whole lot of economic and
Mhm.
social things.
Yep.
Um, and for us in America, rights are liberties. And if you just think of them as liberties, children should
Yep.
not have the same liberties that adults have. So it's a
Absolutely.
term that just doesn't work for us. And we tested it and got laughed out of the room by the general public, quite frankly.
Yeah, and sadly, that effort to use a human rights framework has been around for a long time, and it has not worked. I don't think people should stop trying, right? Because
Correct.
fundamentally, it is about, what you are guaranteed as a person, right? In a community, in a society, right? As opposed to what's been granted to you by law, right? Or regulation.
Right. So we are in the process of reframing, in essence, the UN Convention in a way that's relevant to our society. So, for
That's
example,
amazing.
the United Nations Convention says that children have a right to safe spaces to play.
Yes.
Uh, we would say that for American audiences, we should say one of the most important things we can do to care for our kids is to make sure that they have safe places to play. Says the
Mhm.
same thing. Says the same thing, says it in a way that's going to land better with an American culture.
Yeah, wonderful. Let me try to get to a couple of these other questions that came through from the audience. And this is for you, Iola. Does United Way Worldwide, and you touched on this a little bit, but want to give you another opportunity. Do you do any work in identifying what those bright spots are with respect to certain strategies and which are highly scalable? So where are the bright spots
Mhm.
that you see that can be scaled to other places?
Absolutely, we do, and we thread it throughout our work. So there's what we do from a marketing and communications
Mhm.
perspective around, and that team doing a great job of lifting up those bright spots using the data. So we start with the data and the stories, and United Ways, we ask them to report on their best work, best foot forward. And so we mine that for content that then goes through a variety of communications channels, both internal on our internet and then
Mhm,
on our website and our social media. So that's more of the
mhm,
communications, like lifting up and
mhm,
making visible, sort of talking about that work. And then on the impact team and several other teams throughout the building, we thread it throughout um, our our learning opportunities,
mhm,
webinars like this, and identifying United Ways that we think whose work is emblematic is both emblematic of
Mhm.
common areas of work in the network, and then it's done at a level of quality that we want to highlight. And we train on sort of what are the ways to, there's a set of high level strategies that we think are absolutely scalable. And that's in terms of, that resident community engagement, use of data, how do you, develop strategy development, thinking about systems versus direct services and having,
Mhm.
so there's
Mhm.
a mindset to community impact that will lead you to implementing strategies and approaches we think that will be effective, right?
Right.
And the other piece of that is we sometimes will put that in a publication. So we'll put that out and share it in terms of lessons learned, things that we want to make sure the network is aware of. So through both the publications that we do, the communications
Mhm.
and marketing work that is done, and then the learning and training opportunities, we are threading United Way work and throughout that. Just a quick
Great.
thing, I know we're wrapping up on scale. I think that's the challenge that we have now. I think
Mhm.
we know a lot of what works to
Yes.
support early childhood development and to support youth success. It is to reach the hardest to reach children and
Mhm.
youth and families, and to scale those, to have the sustainable investment and the will to sustain that. I
Yeah.
don't think we lack of knowing what works. We know exposing kids to a literacy rich environment where they have the access to be read to read books. We know that supports early language development. We know we have longitudinal data that shows us that early childhood programs have outcomes that the longitudinal studies are, those people are now, I think, maybe middle age or seniors, that
Yeah.
show what those lifetime outcomes are when you make those early investments. So it's doing
Absolutely.
that in a way that's quality, that's access, that reduces the gaps and disparities and who has access to that. So we know
Yeah.
what to do. We need the will to do it at scale.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll double down on that, triple down on it, because we focus on a whole family approach. Whole family approaches are inherent in Indigenous communities here and around the world, right? The settlement house movement of the late 1800s was about supporting the entire family. So we know what works. Again, it's the political will. So doubling down on that. We have about 3 more minutes, and I have a few questions that I just really want to tick through. And one was, and this I believe is for you, David. Did you gather data on disability status when you were doing your research?
Uh, did we cut our subjects by disability status? I
Yeah.
don't think so.
Okay. Wonderful.
I don't think so. We many other demographic things we have data by, but we do not by disability status.
Okay. 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 Wonderful. And then, Gretchen, this question is for you. Why did your team select the Peabody Development Motor Scale for your master's teachers program?
Because the master teachers go in and they really, really focus on that language and literacy component.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, really amazing to see the transformation. They do a total room arrangement and every single thing is labeled in the classroom. So
Yeah.
children are exposed to those words and those letters and understand that those letters have meanings, right? The
Mm-hmm.
basics of literacy. And so that Peabody test specifically test that those expressive language and receptive language skills. We do a couple other tests that we measure in the classroom. We use the class test as well and the 99 indicators. That one tests more the teacher to determine, is that teacher speaking
Mm-hmm.
to the children? Is that teacher coming down to the child's level? Is
Mm-hmm.
that teacher using too harsh of a language?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's 3 different tools that we use. I just chose the Peabody to share with you on the presentation today
Wonderful.
because of
Thank
that
you.
language
Thank
assessment.
you. And I know we have just 1 more minute before I to turn it back over to Bonnie, but there is a question in the Q&A that, and some of this came up in the chat, and that is about today's context. A lot has happened over the last week. A lot will be happening going forward. And one of the questions was the equity frameworks that have been and are still very important to the United Way, do you have a plan for a change in semantics around that? And the other, commentary that was in the chat is like, where's the conversation about what is happening currently with the executive orders and what's coming through with the new administration?
I'll make one quick comment to both of those and then let Iola make a comment. The culture that we are in today, that everybody's reacting to, is the same culture that was here 6 months ago.
And yeah.
Right. So if we don't like this, we need to change culture. This government is a reflection of the culture, right? So if we don't like this, we need to change culture. As far as equity, there is a lot in our work about how to talk about equity in ways that is better, more acceptable to a broader swath of this culture. And we can't avoid talking about it. We should never avoid talking about it, but there are ways to do it in constructive ways that we talk about quite a bit in our work.
Absolutely. And Iola, I'll let you have the last word here.
Sure. So we've been having lots of internal conversations, and I can share without getting out ahead of that work that we are talking about what are the tools and resources we need to provide to our network so they can navigate the current landscape. So that is forthcoming, and that's a cross-functional effort across our impact, policy, DEI, and network engagement teams here at United Way. And that includes like the resources and tools like the equity framework and what, if anything, we may need to do there. And I would say, in terms of, just to double click on what David said, it's finding ways to help people understand equity at a fundamental level of fairness. Because
Absolutely.
I do think a mindset of fairness is another, when we think about mindsets, I do think that there is a critical mass of people in the country that believe in fairness and
That is so
believe in
true.
opportunity. And so it's, how do we tie those things together with equity and make it tangible and meaningful and real? So it's not this lofty term, but we can do the translation for people for whom equity is not sort of just rolling off the tongue on a daily basis like it is maybe for me. But I think that's the work that we have to do to try to connect that to some of the mindsets that do resonate with people.
Thank you so much, Iola, Gretchen, and David. Amazing conversation. Thank you for your presentations and your commitment to these issues. Bonnie, I know we're at time, so I'm turning it back over to you to close us out.
We are, and I just want to say, fabulous conversation. And as Iola and Marjorie and I, as kind of co-conspirators in designing some of these sessions, we may need part 2 of this conversation because I feel like there's lots of energy here. So I'm going to dispense with my closing comments to just say again, thank you to Gretchen, to David, to Iola, to Marjorie for fabulously facilitating. And stay tuned. You guys keep track of all the upcoming webinars that are happening with the campaign. And again, thanks to all of you for hanging in there and being with us today. We really appreciate it. Have a great day, everybody.